Aqui estamos para mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples, da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. O tema de hoje é o Brexit e vamos ter o prazer de conversar com um especialista conceituado em ciências da política e economia que nos vai explicar por que razão isto do Brexit não é assim tão simples. R. Daniel Kelemen é o diretor do Departamento de Political Science na Rutgers University de Nova Iorque. A sua especialidade é a União Europeia e o seu livro Eurolegalism, The Transformation of Law and Regulation in the European Union ganhou o prémio de melhor do ano em 2011 para o European Union Studies Association. Desde então já publicou várias obras sobre o tema da política e economia na União Europeia e hoje está aqui connosco para partilhar as suas opiniões, também as suas ideias relativamente ao que se passa com o Brexit, que seria justo dizer, é um tema que tem passado um bocadinho ao lado da atualidade internacional devido à pandemia do Covid-19 e também à guerra na Ucrânia. Não deixa de ser, contudo, um tema muito, muito importante e que afeta a relação entre o Reino Unido e a União Europeia. Dan, it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you today. Let's get going and let's be honest as well. I think it'd be fair to say that for the British government, it's been pretty lucky that we've had a pandemic and now a war, because this topic of Brexit hasn't really been on the news agenda as much as it would have been otherwise. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely fair. It's a bit brutal to think like this, but if we're honest about it politically, the pandemic has been a godsend for the Brexiteers in particular, because the timing coincided so well with the first economic impacts of Brexit that it really disguised them. And now, of course, with the war in Ukraine, that's a new factor that gives the government an excuse for some of the moves it's making.
So how much of a disaster, in your opinion, has Brexit been for the UK, and how has it impacted the main industries in the country, and then also the standard of living?
Well, economically, there's no question that it's been a disaster. I mean, let's go back now and let's put this in context. No one's saying that Brexit is putting the UK back into the Stone Ages or something like that. So it's not, turning it into, a developing country. Of course not. But it's a real sizable impact. The first really good study on this that was in pre-pandemic 2019 showed that already just in the 3 years between 2016 and 2019, the British economy was 3% smaller than it would have been. That was the estimate if not for Brexit. So it's having a real impact. And then some recent studies have showed dramatic impacts on exports and trade with the EU, down as much as 25% by some estimates.
25% is a huge number. I lived in the UK for 7 years. I have a lot of international friends who still live there. And they've also said how much it's impacted not only the price of some basic goods in supermarkets, but also services and employment. And not only in the financial center of the city, but also basic services and restaurants, so on. Are people there, and I'm talking about more the British people, really aware of how much it is due to Brexit and how much it is other factors, which I guess the government also tries to use to distract them?
I don't think they're very aware. I mean, as you said, services are really crucial. Let's keep in mind that the service industries are 80% of the British economy. There's understandably a lot of focus on goods in trucks moving back and forth, and that has been affected as well. But it's really services and humans and the workers, of which, of course, there were more than 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and working before Brexit. And so everything from hotels to restaurants, many of these industries were heavily dependent on migrants from Europe, and they've had a hard time finding staff. But I don't think most British people are aware, precisely because that coincided with the pandemic and the travel restrictions, and so that could be blamed.
Let's look at this from the European Union standpoint, because obviously it was very difficult to understand, let's be honest. And then once it happened, how has it affected that relationship? And not only with trade, but the political dynamic between both the continent and the islands, I guess?
Well, I think it's had very damaging effects because the course of the negotiations, as you'll remember, it's been very fraught, where there was a lot of feeling from the EU side of bad faith negotiations coming from some of the British negotiating teams. And there are still tensions over Ireland and Northern Ireland. Just this week, or in the past week or two, we had announcements from Jacob Rees-Mogg, the British Opportunities Minister, as they call him, that they might even be tearing up the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think there's been a lot of tension. At the same time, in particular in the context of things like the war in Ukraine, which I'm sure we'll talk about, there's definitely an effort on both sides to remind each other of the importance of not only the economic, but the security ties.
Do you think that the pandemic actually worked to keep the European Union and the United Kingdom collaborating more closely than they would have been had they not been dealing with the pandemic?
Well, I think unfortunately less than one would have hoped, because right at the beginning of the pandemic response, there was a lot of tension between the two sides about some of the things about imports of the materials needed for production of vaccines, about the approval of different vaccines, and kind of recriminations on both sides. I think the UK government was really trying to make a big point of the fact that they rolled out their vaccination campaign very quickly and trying to sell that as a benefit of Brexit. So that also led to some tensions.
When it comes to the dynamic of the relationships between the United Kingdom and the EU, and the kind of power shifts that have existed in Europe, and we'll talk about the French elections in a moment. Do you think that the way that the British also dealt with the pandemic and a little bit of all these current scandals and speculative stories regarding Boris Johnson and his government have changed the way that Europe sees Great Britain and their standing?
Well, I think people are able to distinguish Boris Johnson as a personality. I think there's a good understanding across a lot of Europe. He's covered a lot in the media that he is a rather odd character. And I think despite maybe some of the ill feelings about him and his government, there's still really a fondness and a respect and admiration for many things in Britain across many European countries. So I think the good relations can kind of outlast him and his government. But certainly for now, he has been a sort of source of tension in relations.
Yeah, odd character is a good way to put it, Dan. Do you think that Brexit could ever be reversed if it continues to be a disaster, and if there's not another story that takes away from its relevance, and it really starts becoming something that the British government and the British people especially react?
One never wants to say never in politics, but I see it as highly, highly unlikely, and certainly no time in the near future. And in fact, I'd say in retrospect, maybe one of the mistakes of some of the people who were in the Remain camp in the UK, who really wanted to maintain membership, was to try to block Brexit before it happened. Remember, some were trying to get a second referendum to stop it, or now saying it should be reversed. I think that we have to accept that for better or worse, and I think for worse, this has happened, and the two sides need to work on building as close a relationship as possible going forward, rather than trying to reverse it. I mean, frankly, if nothing else, I'm not sure the EU would be so eager to have the UK back in right away if they applied, just in light of everything that's happened.
And we mentioned Boris Johnson and his leadership a little bit. I mean, and it's hard to have a look at the national newspapers on a week-to-week basis without some kind of behavior, either from Boris Johnson or someone prominent in the Tory government, being painted in bad light. But he has also been compared a little bit to Donald Trump. Is that fair? And how much is the Tory party to blame here regarding the way in which Great Britain is conducting internal and international politics?
Well, I think the comparison is fair. There's, of course, some key differences in the two of them as people, but both of them, I think, relied on this strategy. In fact, Boris Johnson was interviewed about this once. I think he referred to it as a dead cat strategy, where sort of one scandal after another that and one sort of outrageous statement in the press is a technique he uses to distract attention from past scandals. So that kind of leads to the pattern you were describing there. So I think there's a parallel in their strategy, and they were both very successful in manipulating the media. And so I think it's a fair parallel.
And actually that brings up an interesting point, because the feeling I get, and I'm not an expert at all, but since I'm speaking with one, I wanted to get your opinion on this, on how much there is still a preoccupation with political parties to respect core human values, and many times also respect the truth when it comes to hanging on to power. Because the feeling I get is that across the international landscape, politics is becoming increasingly polarized. Obviously, social media has a lot to do with that. There's less and less people who are in the center. You're either a far right or far left, or it's at least trending that way. First of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, what can be done so that parties and politicians are held accountable for propagating lies and ideology that is just basically doesn't have any foundation on the truth?
Well, I think it's absolutely true what you described. There's been a great polarization on both sides of the Atlantic. That certainly happened here in my country, but in many countries across Europe, we've seen this. And I think with that polarization, what happens, politics becomes more like a team sports, where if you think about when you're watching a football match or something, you decide first which is your team, and then your interpretation of everything depends on that. You scream at the referee, oh, they're always wrong, that sort of thing, if they do anything against your team. And politics has become like that, where people don't, let's say, maybe scrutinize the politician and things they say as much as they should, but they just assume you're on my team, you must be right, the other guys must never win, and they're unacceptable. So that's the kind of toxic atmosphere. In terms of what can be done about it, I think the biggest thing is just to maintain pluralism in politics. As long as you have enough competing voices and free media, then there's always hope for some principled leader to call out those kind of falsehoods and that sort of thing. Where it gets dangerous is when anyone gets too much of a stranglehold on power and on the media as well.
Well, there's no doubt about it, and obviously we know the case in the States with Donald Trump, but there seems to be a trend even in Europe for more autocratic leaders, and I know something that you've written about and something you're worried about is democratic backsliding. When you look at what's happening in Europe, whether that's in Poland, in Hungary, in Slovenia, until recently, we also had a leader there that was quite extreme in his ideology. How worried should we be about this in Europe? Because we're on the border of a lot of these countries.
Well, I think you should be very worried, frankly. I've said for a long time that if you think of the different crises the EU has faced over the past decade or so, and there have been a lot of them, the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, the pandemic, et cetera. Well, one of those crises that has received, I think, the least attention, but in a way is the most threatening, is this rise of autocracy crisis. And Hungary is a great example where by all kind of measures of experts and ranking organizations, the government of Hungary no longer qualifies as a democracy. It's a kind of soft authoritarian government. And when someone's sitting in Portugal, that may seem very far away. And you may think, well, that's the problem of the people in Hungary. But the problem is that if you're in a union together, right, the European Union, then it's sort of like the idea of the reason we don't have smoking sections in airplanes, right? Because smoke in one section will spread to fill the cabin. And likewise, if you have autocracy in one EU member state, well, they'll try to spread that in Brussels, and it could affect you eventually far across the continent.
That's a great analogy, and it takes me back to when I was actually traveling, and when I went to study in the States. I had the transatlantic flight, and it was impossible to avoid people smoking in the 90s on an airplane. It was an absolute nightmare, and I've never heard that comparison. I think it's a very, very adequate and visual one. I think it works very well, and we have seen, I mean, and if there were any people who were ignoring what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe, you had the case in France, right, with the elections and how close Marine Le Pen came to beating Emmanuel Macron. What's your reading of that situation, and how much of a bullet has the EU dodged?
Well, the EU dodged the biggest possible bullet, because as bad as it is to have a far-right autocratic leader in a country like Hungary, we can imagine how much worse it would be to have such a leader, or an aspiring autocrat, let's call her, in one of the leading EU member states, one of the biggest, most influential, like France. And certainly she had toned down some of her rhetoric, and she was no longer pushing for France to exit the EU as she had in the past. That's in part because of Brexit and how bad it went. But nevertheless, someone like her in power would have been a real threat. And it's not just her sort of far-right ideology, which some of us, most of us, I would hope, would reject, but it's what the leaders like that tend to do once they get in power, which is they consolidate authority, try to shut down independent press and judiciary, and move their countries in an autocratic direction.
Look, I think everybody that I talk to, both in Portugal, an international community of expats living here, I think everybody was shocked at how close that was leading into the second round of voting. So I think especially alarming was the timing of it, considering that we have seen the links to Russia and the I guess the maximum exponent of autocratic leader in Europe at the moment, that is of course Vladimir Putin. What do you think the situation there is doing to wake Europeans up to the dangers of democratic backsliding?
Well, certainly in a general sense, first of all, I think the invasion of Russia of Ukraine and the threat of the very aggressive regime in Moscow is certainly pulling Europe together in a general sense, right? And it's encouraging a push to strengthen the common security policies of the EU. So that's one thing. But it also is reminding people, of the threats of authoritarianism, and reminding people that Putin had certain allies across the EU, because, of course, he has been funding some of these far-right and autocratic parties and cultivating close ties with them. With Viktor Orban, who we talked before, is the closest ally of Putin within the EU, sometimes vetoes EU actions kind of on Putin's behalf. And then on the other hand, you have parties like Le Pen's party that got their financing and banking at earlier stages through banks associated with the Kremlin.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, for me, it's tragic what's happening in the Ukraine, obviously, but at the moment, what's equally scary, if not more, is how that crisis will eventually be resolved, and if it will spill over into other areas of Eastern Europe. In your opinion, what is the danger of that, and how far would the EU and NATO go before they draw a line in the sand?
Well, first, I think Putin will not invade a NATO country. And there's been a lot of debate, of course, about NATO enlargement, whether it was a good idea or bad idea, that sort of thing. But I think one thing we can see clearly is that there's a huge distinction between being in NATO and not, which is that countries that are in NATO have benefited from that protective umbrella, and he won't try to provoke a response there. However, I think in terms of this question of involvement, in a sense, we're already involved. True, there's no direct fighting, thank goodness, and everyone's doing everything to avoid NATO engaging militarily with Russia. However, we're already supplying heavy weaponry on a mass scale to Ukraine. So we're directly involved in the conflict in that sense.
And as you look ahead to the next, I guess it's so difficult to look ahead to a decade these days because everything moves so quickly. But as you look into the near future, let's call it, what are the biggest threats to the EU? And going back to the UK where we started, where will the UK's role be politically, economically, and what can be the way that the Brexit's going to go from now and how it affects the near future?
Okay, well, a few things you raised there. I mean, in terms of some of the biggest threats, well, there's, of course, threats we haven't even talked about, just big global threats like climate change, things like that. The EU is a real leader there, so that's something very strong the EU is doing. I think Russia, as long as Putin is in control, will continue to pose a threat. But more generally, the threat from Russia is reminding people also of the vulnerability the EU has, because a lot of its key decisions on questions like foreign policy are still done by unanimity, right? And so, for instance, we have some countries, threatening to veto any sanctions on oil and gas that would target Russia. And that veto is a problem because that means if any hostile power, Russia or even China, can kind of cultivate one ally within the EU, then they can threaten to shut down common action. So that's a threat. And I think the other threat I would mention is just this threat of democratic backsliding, of the emergence of more regimes like Orban's in Hungary. That would be a huge problem for a union that's supposed to be based on democracy. And finally, you asked about Britain. I think the big question going forward will just be maybe if we look forward past the Boris Johnson government to a more normal British government, if there'll be a prospect for healing relations and bringing the UK and the EU closer together. That would be my hope.
Okay, so I have to ask you this as we're wrapping up the main part of the interview. If you could give Boris Johnson any advice, and I'm not going to get into internal politics here, but regarding Brexit and the way in which that has worked out and anything that could be amended, what would it be?
Well, I'll give it, but I know he wouldn't follow it. My advice would be stop lying. Because Boris Johnson, I think one can defend Brexit. It's the right of any country. This is in the EU treaties. If a country wants to leave the European Union, that's right there in the treaties. There's an exit provision. It's fine to leave the EU. It's a voluntary union, right? The problem with Brexit and the Brexiteers was that they lied so much about the potential costs. They said there would be no costs. It would all be benefits and a wondrous future. And they even lied about things like whether they would have to put border checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, to resolve the tensions over the borders, et cetera. So they just need to be straight with the people and really admit what are the costs and benefits and trade-offs.
Honesty is always a good trait, and it leads in perfectly into our final section, which is some quick fire questions that we have for all our guests. And so in one sentence, I would say, if not in one word, but in one sentence, if I could please ask you to try to answer these questions that I know could take a lot longer, by the way. But what is one personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having?
Integrity.
Yeah, which is many times forgotten in light of other interests that are in play. In your opinion, what is the biggest challenge humanity is facing today?
Climate change, I'd say.
It's good that that's still on the agenda. If you could change one thing in the world today by magic, by supreme power, what would it be?
End the pandemic.
Yes. And what is the most important learning of your life and career, and why?
I think something my father taught me. It wasn't his saying, it's an old saying, I think, but it's don't believe your own propaganda. In other words, definitely be honest with yourself, about your own abilities, your own weaknesses, and all those things. Know thyself and be honest with thyself.
Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you here on the Foundation show. All the best, and let's hope that some senior people in the British government also have an opportunity to watch this conversation, this dialogue, and heed some of the advice and insight that you've shared. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you so much, Pedro.
Foi mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples. Our Daniel Kelemen a explicar-nos por que razão o Brexit não é assim tão simples e a deixar conselhos e ideias importantes para o governo britânico. Até breve.